We're going to finish saying a little more about how the demand side of the market works. Then we will move to the supply side and talk about how the supply side works, the producer surplus produced by the supply side, and factors that shift the supply curve. Now we're going to introduce some terminology. The terminology is this: an increase in demand. Now let's be clear, when we say an increase in demand, and demand, the word demand is by itself, what we mean is that the entire curve is going to shift to the right. The entire demand curve will shift to the right. And when you see that happen, what it means is if you quote a price, then buyers are willing to buy more. In an equivalent way of looking at the diagram, when demand increases and the demand curve shifts to the right, that also means that for a given quantity, people are willing to pay a higher price. So let's use the diagram to illustrate how an increase in demand is depicted on the demand curve diagram. So imagine the blue curve there is the initial demand curve, and that tells you, for example, at $25 a barrel, the buyers want to buy 70 million barrels of oil. Suppose something happens, some shock, like people want to fly more for some reason that's external to this diagram. People just suddenly want to fly more. Let's suppose they want to drive more, they want to travel more, everything else equal. Then you'd show that on the diagram by drawing a new demand curve, the red line there. And the red line represents an increase in demand. It's important to be very particular here. The word increase in demand means that you're moving that blue line to the right. And that means that at $25 a barrel, as you can see, quantity demanded will be a higher number. Okay, so at the same price, quantity demanded goes up. Or an equivalent way of looking at the same phenomenon is to say that if you kept the supply of oil at $70 for some reason, then buyers would be willing to pay $50 per barrel. But just think of diagrammatic terms. An increase in demand means the entire demand curve moves to the right, and then you figure out what's going to happen after that. We can also go in the opposite direction, a decrease in demand. That means the demand curve is moving to the left, so that at any particular price, people wish to buy less than before. And at each quantity, people are expecting they should only have to pay a lower price. So here you see it on the diagram, and that's a lot easier to sort of understand the intuition. The blue line is the initial, what we'll call oil demand. And you can see if we quote a price of $50 a barrel, quantity demanded is 74 million barrels of oil. And if we decrease demand, the demand curve shifts to the left. And if the demand curve shifts to the left, you get different buying behavior from before. If people are quoted a $50 price for oil, they're only willing to buy 62 million barrels. Likewise, you could say that if we keep the quantities the same at 74, people expect to pay less. So a decrease in demand means that the demand curve moves to the left, and that might be triggered by, let's say, a big fall in airline travel, a big fall in people driving around. And we intuitively expect that if those things happen, then we expect to be paying less for oil and this less for gasoline, and this diagram demonstrates that. So what kind of factors might shift the demand curve to the right or to the left? Well, there's a bunch of them. One thing is income. So for example, if income goes up, everything else equal, you'd expect an increase in demand for any particular good or service. So income goes up, people buy more, they fly more, they travel more. That would normally make the demand curve moved to the right. If the population increases, that would normally make the demand curve move to the right. A little more complicated, the price we're willing to pay for a good depends on sometimes the price of related goods. So if you have two sorts of goods that are substitutes for each other, you can use one thing or the other, then you can have a shift in demand for what we'll call the primary good if there's something happening to the price of the substitute good, or think of it as the competing good. The competing good becomes cheaper. Then the primary good, the one who we're worrying about, its price, its demand curve might change. A complement is two goods that are used together. So if something happens to the price of a complementary good, then that could affect the demand of what we'll call a primary good. Expectations about the future can matter. So if we all expect the price of oil to go up in the future, maybe something causes us to think that there's some news, some new development. If we think the future price of something we want is going to go up, maybe we'll buy more of it now. That's like an increase in demand now. And finally, of course, tastes. If people suddenly develop a desire for something that before they didn't really care for, that would show up as a move to the right in the demand curve. Now, we are not going to spend a lot of time working out all of these different scenarios. That's something that gets covered in principles of microeconomics. For macroeconomics, we don't have to think too much about all these complicated scenarios. So let's talk about the supply curve. And the producers of oil have the opposite incentives from the buyers of oil. Producers of oil like high prices. So if the price of oil is $55 a barrel, then that makes oil profitable for even the high cost producers of oil. At $55 a barrel, it's possible to make a profit even if you're drilling in Alaska. Now, if the price of oil falls to, let's say, $20 a barrel, those high-cost producers of oil are going to effectively be cut out of the market. They cannot afford to produce oil and make a profit if the price per barrel is $20. So as the price of oil moves from being high to low, more and more producers will exit the market. If the price of oil is only $5 a barrel, only the very lowest cost producers can afford to stay in business and make a profit. Now, just like for the demand curve, you can read the diagram in two different ways. At any point, for any given demand curve, we could move horizontally and say at a given price, how much are suppliers willing to sell? So the idea is a supply curve is defined by quoting a price and then answering the question, how much are suppliers willing to sell? Alternatively, in sort of the equivalent way of getting the same result, you can look vertically, and that means that you start out picking a quantity and then going up to the supply curve and reading across and answer the question, what price must oil be selling for in the market to induce producers to produce that quantity of oil? So the supply curve is a function that shows the quantity supplied at different prices. And quantity supplied is the quantity that sellers are willing and able to sell at a particular price. And of course, quantity supplied is basically determined by, at minimum, you have to be covering the cost of the seller's cost of production. So here's a little diagram in the case of the oil market showing the so-called law of supply. If the market price is very low, then relatively little oil will be provided. As the price of oil per barrel increases, then more and more is produced. So as you move from left to right on the horizontal, the vertical axis value increases. Supply also has a concept of surplus. It works differently from consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the producer's gain from exchange, and what that means is you take the market price at which a product is being sold, and you take the minimum or break-even price at which a producer would be willing to sell a particular quantity, and the difference between those two things is the producer surplus. Actually, just think of it as the producer profit. That gives you the right intuition. Producers make a profit to the degree that they're selling oil at a price higher than just covering their cost of production. So here's a diagram that shows you the concept of producer surplus. And what you see there is that if the market price is $40, then total producer surplus is equal to that blue shaded area. And the intuition goes like this. Start on the far left on the quantity axis. For the first producer, who is the lowest cost producer, to produce a barrel of oil, they don't need a very high price. They can produce a barrel of oil at a relatively low cost, like $5 a barrel, and break even. Now, let's suppose the market price is 40. So the seller of oil, whose production cost is only $5, but gets to sell at $40, they are making a profit of $35. So the distance on the furthest to the left axis, horizontal axis point, that is a big gap, and it's a gap in a positive way for the producer. They produce at 5, they sell at 40. That's $35 of profit. Now let's imagine we start moving to the right along that quantity of oil axis, and what we're doing is effectively we're moving from low-cost producers of oil to slightly higher cost producers of oil, then to medium cost producers of oil, and then on the far right we're getting into the territory of very high cost producers of oil. And that's why that thick blue line goes up to the right. We're moving from the lowest cost producers located in Saudi Arabia to the high cost producers or suppliers. Producer and supplier means the same thing here. As we get to the far end of the right of the blue line, we're getting up into Alaska and drilling in the North Sea type oil. So if you add up the profit of all the producers who are able to make some profit at $40 a barrel. It comes to that blue area. That area represents total producer surplus. Now, one more question. What about beyond the 40-degree price? When we get up to 41-degree, $41 a barrel, $42 a barrel, then we're into the territory where no producers will produce at all. So that's because they cannot afford to cover their costs. That area on the right of the blue line where there is no producer surplus, those are the producers who are in effect checking out of the market. They're not going to produce anything. They cannot even cover their costs at $40. So that's the diagram illustrating the area and the area of producer surplus at the price of $40. Now, if the price went up in the market to $60 a barrel, then all the producers could enter the market and make a profit. And then you'd have a bigger area for producer surplus. Just like we can have increases or decreases in demand, so too we can have increases or decreases in supply. And if we increase supply, we show that by shifting the supply curve to the right. If you shift the supply curve to the right, for any given price, producers are willing to sell more. Also, it means that given any quantity, producers are willing to accept a lower price. Now, when we say we shift the supply curve to the right, we are not at that point explaining why the supply curve shift to the right. It could shift, for example, because there's new technology that makes it easier to produce oil at the same price. So we can show an increase in supply by shifting the supply curve to the right. And at this new supply curve, we have the sort of changes that we had in demand. Now, if the market price stayed the same, but we've got the shift to the right in supply, that means for the same price, producers are willing to produce more. So the shift in the supply curve to the right might happen because, for example, of better drilling technology that allows more producers to make profit even if the market price has not changed. Likewise, another way to look at it is that if the supply curve moves to the right, but for some reason we fix the amount of oil produced at the same level as before, keep it at $60, then the suppliers will be willing to continue to supply $60, but they don't need a $40 price to induce them to do that. Because of new efficient drilling, suppliers can continue and producers can continue to produce oil at 60 million barrels of oil, even if the price of oil were to fall. And a decrease in supply means a move to the left. When we talked about a decrease in demand, we were talking about the demand curve moving to the left. When we talk about a decrease in supply, we talk about the supply curve moving to the left. And that will mean at any particular price, sellers will offer less, and at any fixed quantity, sellers will demand a higher price. Now, to give you the intuition, what might cause a decrease in supply? Well, something like it suddenly becomes more risky and dangerous and costly to produce oil. Something like that would shift the supply curve to the left. So let's show a decrease in supply. Decrease in supply means the supply curve moves to the left. And if the supply curve moves to the left, then there are two ways to look at it. Keep the price per barrel the same, and you keep the price per barrel the same, then what's going to happen is less oil will be supplied. At a lower price per barrel, some prior producers are now unable to make a profit, so they will drop out of the market. Only the very lowest cost producers will continue to produce if the market price of oil per barrel has fallen to 28. The other way to look at it is, what if we somehow keep the supply of oil the same? Then what's going to have to happen as a result of this move in the supply curve to the left is that in order to keep the price of the quantity of oil produced the same, keep the quantity of oil produced the same, you would need somehow to have an increase in the market price.